Today's story is full of suspense and mystery, so grab your seat and get ready for a spine-chilling ride. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with all the new stories. Tom was a seasoned truck driver, having spent over 2 decades hauling goods across remote highways and deserted roads. The solitude of the open road never bothered him. In fact, he cherished it. It gave him peace. But that peace was shattered one stormy night on a highway deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The storm had come out of nowhere, and the rain fell so hard it was like a wall of water against his windshield. Visibility was near zero, and Tom could barely see the road ahead. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white, as his headlights barely cut through the thick sheets of rain. It was the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where radio signals die, and there's nothing but nature for miles around. As he rounded a sharp bend, his headlights illuminated something up ahead. A figure standing on the side of the road, drenched and shivering. A woman. She was waving her arms frantically, clearly desperate for help. Tom was not the type to pick up hitchhikers, especially not in such a storm, but there was something about her that tugged at him. Maybe it was the way she looked so small and frail, or maybe it was the sheer desperation in her movements. Against his better judgment, he pulled over. The woman hurried to the passenger side, her clothes soaked, clinging to her body. Her hair was plastered to her face, but Tom could see she was young, maybe in her early 20s. She opened the door and climbed in without hesitation, her teeth chattering from the cold. Thank you so much," she said, her voice shaky but full of relief. "I thought I was going to die out there." "No problem," Tom muttered, shifting uncomfortably. "Where are you headed?" "Just down the road," she replied, her eyes flicking nervously toward the storm outside. "There's a small town not too far from here. Can you take me there?" Tom nodded, though he knew there wasn't a town for at least another 50 miles. But he didn't question her. She was clearly distressed, and maybe the weather had her confused. As they drove, the silence between them grew heavy. Tom tried to make small talk, but the woman wasn't much for conversation. She just stared out the window, her expression blank, as the rain beat relentlessly against the truck. Something about her unnerved him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Then, after about 20 minutes of driving, she spoke again. "Turn left at the next road," she said softly. Tom frowned. There wasn't a road there. He was sure of it. He had driven this route dozens of times, and the next turnoff wasn't for miles. But when they approached the spot she mentioned, there it was. A narrow dirt road that he swore had never been there before. Reluctantly, he made the turn. The road was dark, lined with towering trees that seemed to close in on them as they drove deeper into the forest. The further they went, the more the uneasy feeling in Tom's gut grew. Something wasn't right. The woman remained silent, staring straight ahead, her face expressionless. Tom's palms began to sweat, and he noticed that the temperature in the truck had dropped significantly. He turned up the heater, but the cold only seemed to grow. Suddenly, the woman spoke again. "You need to stop here." Tom looked around. They were in the middle of nowhere, the road barely visible under the thick canopy of trees. There was no sign of a town, no lights in the distance, nothing but endless darkness. "I can't stop here," he said, his voice shaky. "This isn't a safe place. Please," she insisted, her tone now almost pleading. "You have to stop." Against every instinct screaming at him not to, Tom pulled over to the side of the road. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the night was eerily quiet. The woman turned to him, her face pale and her eyes wide with something that looked like fear, or maybe regret. "Thank you," she whispered, "but you shouldn't have stopped." Before Tom could respond, she opened the door and stepped out into the night. As soon as her feet touched the ground, she vanished. Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He blinked, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard they hurt. The woman had disappeared right in front of him, swallowed by the darkness. He scrambled out of the truck, looking around frantically, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had never been there. Panicked, he jumped back into the truck and floored the accelerator, speeding down the narrow road. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no logical explanation. He drove for what felt like hours, desperate to find his way back to the main highway. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he saw the familiar asphalt of the highway ahead. He sighed in relief and merged back onto the main road, his heart still racing. But just as he began to calm down, something caught his eye. Sitting in the passenger seat, reflected in the side mirror, was a small, wet handprint on the window. A handprint that hadn't been there before. Tom's blood ran cold. The temperature in the cab dropped again, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He glanced over to the passenger seat, half expecting to see her sitting there, but it was empty. However, the handprint remained, a chilling reminder that something, or someone, had been with him in that truck, and whatever it wasn't gone. Terrified, Tom didn't stop driving until he reached the next town, hours later. He parked at a truck stop and ran inside, shaking and pale. He tried to explain what had happened to the few drivers sitting around, but they only gave him strange looks. One of the older truckers leaned in and said quietly, "You're not the first to see her. That stretch of road, people say it's haunted. A young woman died there years ago in a car accident. She's been looking for a ride ever since." Tom never drove that route again. Marcus had been a truck driver for most of his life, navigating the highways of the American Midwest. Long stretches of desolate roads and open plains had become his second home. The isolation didn't bother him anymore. He liked the silence, the hum of the engine, the occasional crackle of static on the CB radio. But one stretch of road, Dead Man's Pass, had always given him an uneasy feeling. Dead Man's Pass was notorious among truckers. The winding curves of the mountain road, paired with sheer cliffs, had claimed more than a few lives over the years. Many drivers avoided it if they could, but for Marcus, it was part of his regular route. He had driven through it dozens of times, but every single time he approached those twisted turns, a knot formed in his stomach. It was a dark, cold night when Marcus found himself approaching Dead Man's Pass once again. His cargo had been delayed, and now he was running late, forced to drive through the pass at night, a decision he would soon regret. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the only light came from his truck's high beams, which barely pierced the dense fog clinging to the mountainside. The road was eerily quiet, not a single car or truck in sight, and the silence pressed in on him like a weight. As Marcus navigated the first few bends, he felt a chill creep up his spine. The temperature had dropped, and a thick layer of mist now covered the road, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. He slowed the truck, gripping the wheel tightly, his eyes scanning the road for any sudden obstacles. Then, out of nowhere, his CB radio crackled to life, breaking the heavy silence. "Breaker, breaker, anyone out there?" a gruff voice asked. Marcus picked up the receiver, a sense of relief washing over him. "Yeah, this is Big Red. Who's out there?" The voice on the other end was distorted, as if coming through a tunnel. "You, heading through Dead Man's Pass?" Marcus frowned. The static was so bad he could barely make out the words. "Yeah, I'm about halfway through. Why?" There was a long pause, and when the voice came back, it was barely a whisper. "You should turn back." A cold sweat broke out on Marcus's forehead. "What? Who is this?" The radio went dead. Marcus stared at the CB, his heart pounding. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but the mist was too thick to see anything behind him. He shook his head, trying to shake off the strange encounter. It was probably just some prank, he told himself. Truckers like to mess with each other, especially on roads like this. But as he continued down the pass, the feeling of dread grew. The fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around the truck like a suffocating blanket. The road ahead became narrower, the cliffs on either side steeper, and the drops more treacherous. That's when he saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Marcus slammed on the brakes, his heart racing as the truck skidded to a stop just a few feet from the figure. It was a man, standing completely still, wearing an old-fashioned trucker's cap and a leather jacket. His face was pale, almost ghostly white, and he stared at Marcus with hollow, empty eyes. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. The man looked familiar, though he couldn't place him. Something about his presence was wrong, deeply unsettling. The man raised one hand, pointing down the road. Marcus followed the direction of the man's gesture, but all he could see was more fog. When he looked back, the man was gone, vanished into thin air. Panic set in. Marcus slammed the truck into gear, flooring the accelerator. His tires screeched on the slick road as the truck surged forward, faster than was safe on such a treacherous pass. The narrow road twisted and turned, and Marcus's hands trembled on the steering wheel. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a flash of something running alongside the truck. He glanced to his right and his blood ran cold. The man was back, running alongside the truck, his hollow eyes fixed on Marcus through the passenger window. His feet didn't touch the ground, but he kept pace with the speeding truck as if he were floating through the mist. Marcus screamed, swerving the truck violently as he tried to shake the apparition, but the man stayed with him, his lifeless gaze unblinking. Suddenly, a voice crackled through the CB radio again, distorted and barely audible over the roar of the engine. "You didn't listen. Turn back. Turn back now." Marcus couldn't respond. His mind was consumed by fear as the truck careened around a sharp bend. The mist was so thick now that he could barely see the road, and the cliffs on either side seemed to close in. The man outside the truck raised his hand again, this time pointing directly ahead. Marcus's heart sank as he realized why. Just a few yards ahead, the road had collapsed. The heavy rains from earlier that month had caused a massive landslide, leaving a gaping hole where the road should have been. There was no time to stop, no time to turn around. Marcus yanked the steering wheel to the left, trying to avoid the edge, but the truck's massive weight pulled him toward the abyss. The tires screeched, fighting for traction on the slick road, but it was too late. The truck skidded sideways, teetering on the edge of the cliff. In that moment, Marcus saw the man again, standing just in front of the collapsed road, his hand still raised, his eyes full of sorrow. The truck tipped, the front wheels going over the edge, and Marcus braced himself for the fall. But then, everything went still. The truck didn't fall. It was as if time had stopped. The man stepped forward, placing one hand on the front of the truck. For a brief second, Marcus felt a strange calm wash over him, and then the truck began to move, slowly backing away from the cliff, as if being pulled by an invisible force. When the truck was safely back on solid ground, the man gave Marcus one last look, his expression one of quiet warning, before vanishing into the mist. Shaking, Marcus sat there for a long moment, his hands still gripping the wheel. He didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear. The warnings had been real. If he hadn't stopped, if he hadn't seen the figure, he would have plunged into the abyss. Without looking back, Marcus threw the truck into gear and drove away, leaving Dead Man's Pass behind. He never drove that route again. That was our first terrifying tale of the night. If it gave you chills, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this. And remember, sometimes the road ahead isn't as safe as it seems. Jake had been trucking for nearly 20 years, and he thought he'd seen it all. From long-haul journeys through the desert to icy mountain passes, the road had been his life. But nothing could prepare him for what happened on Route 66 one fateful night. It was late, and Jake was exhausted, hauling a heavy load of machinery across the Arizona desert. The road was desolate, stretching out endlessly in front of him. There were no other cars, no lights, just the vast empty desert on both sides of the highway. The only sound was the hum of his engine and the occasional crackle from his CB radio. As he checked his clock, he realized he'd been driving for nearly 14 hours straight. His eyes were heavy, and the road seemed to blur in front of him. He needed to stop soon, but there wasn't a rest area for miles. Just as he was about to pull over onto the shoulder and take a quick nap, something caught his eye. Up ahead, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. Jake slammed on the brakes, his heart racing as the massive truck screeched to a halt, tires skidding on the asphalt. The figure was completely still, silhouetted against the faint light of the moon. It looked like a person, but something was off. They didn't move, didn't flinch as the truck came dangerously close to hitting them. Jake honked the horn, but the figure remained motionless. Swearing under his breath, he flipped on his high beams, hoping to get a better look at whoever or whatever was standing in the middle of the road. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. The figure was tall, dressed in tattered clothes that seemed too old to belong to anyone from this time. Their face was obscured by shadows, but their eyes, those eyes gleamed with an unnatural light, almost as if they were glowing in the dark. Jake's instincts screamed at him to back up, to get out of there, but something held him in place. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the figure. Then, slowly, it began to move. The figure stepped to the side of the road, allowing Jake to pass. But as it did, the unnatural gleam in its eyes never wavered, following Jake's every move. It was as if it was daring him to keep driving. With trembling hands, Jake pushed the truck back into gear and cautiously drove past the figure, his eyes flicking between the road and his mirrors. When he glanced back, the figure was gone. The road ahead stretched out into darkness once more, and Jake shook his head, trying to shake off the encounter. It had to be his imagination. He was tired, stressed, probably hallucinating from lack of sleep. But the eerie feeling stayed with him. About 10 minutes later, Jake felt a cold shiver run through his body. The temperature in the cab seemed to drop suddenly, and he could see his breath in the air. He turned up the heater, but it didn't help. The cold was bone-chilling, unnatural for the desert night. His heart began to race again when, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement. There, in the rearview mirror, was the figure again, now standing on the side of the road, keeping pace with the truck. It wasn't running. It wasn't even walking. It just seemed to glide along, the glowing eyes locked on Jake. Panic set in. Jake floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as the truck sped up. But no matter how fast he went, the figure was still there, gliding effortlessly beside the truck. Jake grabbed the CB radio, his voice trembling. "This is Big Jake. Is anyone out there? I need help now." Static crackled through the radio, but no one responded. The road ahead seemed endless, and the figure didn't waver. It stayed in the corner of his eye, always there, always watching. Desperate, Jake veered off onto a side road, hoping to shake whatever this thing was. The truck bounced along the uneven pavement, dust kicking up around him. For a moment, he thought he was in the clear, but then the radio crackled to life. "Jake!" A voice whispered through the static. Jake's blood ran cold. He hadn't said his name on the radio. "Who is this?" He shouted into the receiver, his hands shaking. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted by the static. "You shouldn't have come this way. What are you talking about?" Jake yelled, his eyes darting around, looking for any sign of the figure. The voice was louder now, clearer. "You can't escape it. It's always with you." Suddenly, the truck lurched violently as if something had hit it from the side. Jake struggled to keep control of the wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. The truck swerved, tires screeching on the pavement. He could feel something, someone, pushing against the cab, forcing the truck off the road. The figure appeared again, this time in front of the truck, standing in the middle of the side road, its glowing eyes burning into Jake's soul. The voice on the radio came again, this time laughing. "There's no running, Jake. It's too late." Jake screamed, jerking the wheel to avoid hitting the figure, but the truck was moving too fast. The front end skidded, and before Jake could react, the truck crashed into a ditch, flipping onto its side with a deafening crunch of metal. Jake was thrown against the side of the cab, his vision blurring as pain shot through his body. The truck lay on its side, steam hissing from the engine. Everything was quiet, too quiet. For a moment, Jake thought it was over. He thought he had escaped. But then, through the shattered windshield, he saw the figure standing just a few feet away. Its eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, locked onto him, and it began to move toward the truck, slowly, deliberately. Jake tried to move, tried to crawl out of the cab, but his body wouldn't respond. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The figure stopped just outside the cab, leaning down to peer inside. Its face was still hidden in shadows, but Jake could feel its presence, cold and malevolent. The figure reached out a hand, its fingers long and thin, almost skeletal. As it touched the broken glass of the windshield, Jake's vision faded to black, the last thing he saw being those glowing eyes burning into him. When rescuers arrived the next morning, they found Jake's truck overturned in the ditch. The cab was empty, the driver nowhere to be seen. They searched for days, scouring the desert for any sign of him, but Jake was never seen again. To this day, truckers who drive Route 66 at night talk about a strange figure that appears on the side of the road. They say that if you see it, you should turn around, because once it starts following you, it never stops. Be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with others. Stay tuned for more spooky stories, and remember, sometimes the road holds more than just memories.